Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I am joined by repeat guest, one of the brightest minds in the human side of money and behavioral finance, and more importantly, one of the best people in the space. I'm pleased to be joined from across the pond by my friend and yours, Neil Bage. Neil, welcome to the show.
Oh, Daniel, thank you for having me back on. I like that phrase, repeat guest. I think this is 3, maybe 4 times. I don't know, but irrespective, thank you for having me back on.
Okay, so I do believe it's 3, which may put you in the pole position, my friend. You may be the all-time leader in appearances. This is elite air you're in. This is like being a 5-time host of SNL or something. This is rare air, Neil. This is rare air for sure.
I own it, and I'm going to get a T-shirt made with it on the front. So
yes,
I'm going to own it properly.
So now, show us the greatness. Show us why you've been invited back so many times. Let's start with something that I think you and I both believe, which is part of what makes this work so interesting, is that money has this singular power to trigger powerful emotional reactions in us when compared with even other sort of hot button topics in our lives. Neil, what gives money this emotional power over us, do you think?
Oh, a great question to start with, Daniel. And I think the very short answer, which I'll elaborate on, of course, is that money is never about money. And that's really at the heart of it, right? Because so think about the human brain. For the human brain, money is it's a proxy for safety, for freedom, for status, for belonging, maybe even love. And different people attach different meanings to it, which is why 2 people can look at exactly the same financial situation and have completely different emotional responses to it. So, in that situation, one person sees security and the other one sees a trap. So it's like the same numbers, but a completely different experience. And fundamentally, it's because the brain doesn't process money in some separate, abstract financial module, if that's even the right word. It processes it using the same circuits that handle survival threat, social status, and reward. And so a significant market loss can activate the same threat response as being in physical danger. Accumulating money activates the same neural reward circuits as eating when you're hungry. And sometimes we say this, that money feels visceral, and we say it in a kind of flippant way, but actually it's not a metaphor at all. It's literally neurologically accurate. But I'll finish by saying this, money is probably one of the things in life that touches every other dimension of life simultaneously. It shapes where you live. It shapes who you spend time with, what you can do, how you see yourself, how you imagine others seeing you. So when money is threatened, everything in our life feels threatened, which is why financial stress, which we know is, always top 3 around the world when it comes to research, it's why it's so corrosive. And not just to well-being, but to our relationships and to our cognitive function as well. So that's why I say when I talk about this, that it's never about money. It's about everything that money has come to represent.
So, yeah, I think one of the ways that I get, misunderstood if I'm meeting someone for the first time or talking to them at a dinner or a party is when I tell them that I work in finance, they assume that I'm interested in money for money's sake, which couldn't be further from the truth. The reason that I find money fascinating is the reason you just articulated, which is that it's never just about the money and that it's always some proxy for something deeper. Do you feel like some of the problems people have with money come from trying to treat it as this very utilitarian thing and not tapping into the deeper subtext of it?
Yeah, I do. I think we know this, right? That money is relatively, in the evolutionary history of mankind, a new invention. Well, we've been around for 5.5 million years as a species, you could argue, or 300,000 if we want to just talk about Homo sapien. Money's been around for about 3,000 years. And like any invention, the brain has to get used to it. But the challenge with that, Daniel, is the fact that the human brain, it's an old brain trying to navigate a new world. And that ancient wiring often is a conflict with the vast amount of noise it has to deal with, as well as these invented areas of life like money. And so I think that, if the truth be told, I think we struggle with money because we've never really grasped what money is for and what it can do. And we see it as this thing that needs to be accumulated, or a thing that we can attach a label to, like a status. So it's I think I don't think we've ever really got used to what money is and what it's for, and I think that's part of the problem.
Well, let's pull on this thread a bit. This ancient hardware in a modern world. What do you see in the most practical terms possible as the single biggest mismatch between the brain that we've inherited from our ancestral forebears and the world we're living in today?
Well, I've kind of just mentioned it in my previous answer. Literally, this brain was not designed for this world. It's 5.5 million years in the making, or 300,000. And we know that from an evolutionary biology, that evolution is incredibly slow. And culture or cultures change at an incredible speed. So if you think of the very famous Aesop fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, the brain is the tortoise and society's cultures are the hare in that example. So there's a gap. And in that gap is a profound mismatch. So think about what I said in my first answer. The brain is optimized for survival. So it needs to detect physical threats immediately. It needed to navigate small, stable groups of around 150 people, which interestingly is still roughly the limit of genuine social relationships that we can maintain. And it needed to grab calories where it was available because scarcity was norm. It needed to act fast, all of these things. Now, if you think about what we're asking that brain to do today, we're asking it to scroll through a social media feed, which, let's be honest, has been designed by some very clever people to trigger exactly those tribal responses. We're asking it to save money for retirement. That's 30 years away, when the brain is fundamentally wired for immediacy. We're asking you to think about abstract possibility or probability, when it evolved for concrete present threats. And so the thing I want people to take away from this, when we talk about this old brain, new world, is the brain isn't doing anything wrong. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem that we have is that it wasn't built to do what we needed to do in 2026. And often it's kind of at increasing odds with that. So the struggle people experience, they are not signs of weakness. I can't even believe I'm about to say this word. They are not being irrational. Everything that I've said is an entirely predictable consequence of that mismatch.
So we're running this old hardware. It's not fit for purpose. Evolution is enormously slow. We'll all be dead and gone before we ever get the new update to the hardware or the software. So all of this being the case, what's to be done? Because you're right, it's not doing anything it wasn't wired to do, and it's not being irrational in the strictest sense. But in a lot of ways, it doesn't serve us well. So are there one or two sort of themes that you can point to from a sort of a solution-focused way to say, hey, I need this brain to do something different than perhaps it was meant to do, but I need it to do that to survive in this new environment. What are one or two sort of high-level tips for making that happen?
Well, I mean, the one that I talk about more than anything, Daniel, is, just cut yourself some slack and recognize that the brain in your head is doing its job. It's not doing anything. It's not making you irrational or you're not broken in any way, shape or form. the brain is wired to do, to allow you to survive. And just because we haven't yet figured out the difference between, a lion running towards us on the savannah and, a chart that shows a falling stock market, doesn't mean that we're stupid or we don't understand or we don't get it. It's just that the operating system hasn't had an upgrade for a significant amount of time. So the one thing I would do is I would cut myself some slack and recognize that you're not doing anything wrong. But that's not an excuse for not taking the time to try and understand the aspects or the elements of life that are important to understand. I'm not saying people need to become financial advisors or be experts in money, but when we are making important decisions about finance that can have a significant impact on the rest of our lives, we should take some time to at least understand the fundamentals of the decision that we are about to make. We have the agency to do that. We have the agency to add new information into the brain and allow it to rewire itself, through neuroplasticity, that allows us to change the way the brain works. So when we face these challenges in the future, we have more of the tools needed to kind of make those decisions in a good kind of coherent way. So cut yourself some slack. Don't use that as permission to not do anything. And when you're making an important decision about any aspect of life, make sure you at least understand the fundamentals of play so that you can make a decision in an informed way.
Yeah. So you're one of my favorite neuroeconomic thinkers and science translators. That's been on full display here for the past few moments. One of the distinctions that you make is that you describe the brain as a prediction machine rather than a thinking machine, which I think would be a surprise to most people. So explain that difference to us, and then more importantly, perhaps, explain why that's a distinction with a difference, and what does that mean for people's financial decision-making?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of the greatest discoveries in neuroscience in recent years. And it comes from, I want to be slightly technical here, it comes from a framework called predictive processing. And the basic insight is that the brain doesn't passively receive information from the world and then figure out what to do with it. It actually works the other way around. So the brain is constantly generating predictions about what it expects to see, hear, feel, and all that incoming data from our senses is used to update those predictions. So Carl Friston, he's a brilliant brain in this space, and he was like the central figure behind this model. And he describes it in terms of the brain constantly minimizing what he calls prediction errors. Essentially, what we experience as reality is the brain's best current guess being refined on the fly, moment by moment. So we're not so much perceiving the world as we're actually constructing it. And the world, which are obviously happening around us, generally nudges us now and again when we get it wrong. So what that means in practice is that the brain, is deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, because uncertainty means the predictions aren't working. And a brain that can't predict can't stay safe. It's like a fundamental principle. So we experience uncertainty as a threat, even when the stakes are genuinely low. Now, think of that from our world, financial planning and investments. Uncertainty is the central experience of someone's financial life. Will markets go up and down? Will I have enough? Will I outlive my money? Every significant financial question is at its core an unanswerable question. And for a brain wired to experience uncertainty as threat, that's basically neurologically exhausting. But And I finish off, but it really does explain so much of what advisors see in client behavior and why it looks puzzling from the outside. But once you understand it, it makes complete sense. It's that desperate need for prediction, even a bad one, is how the brain works. The flight to cash when markets fall. Not because cash is the right answer, by the way, but because it feels certain. It's the appeal of guaranteed products. regardless of how good they actually are, allows the brain to factor in certainty. So clients aren't being difficult. They're doing exactly what a prediction-hungry brain does when the future doesn't cooperate. They're reaching out for anything that restores the feeling of knowing what's about to happen next.
Yeah, the part that I just took a note on that I will be ruthlessly stealing without attribution, Neil, is that the brain that can't predict can't stay safe. So our brain is always undertaking this effort to predict what's going to happen in financial markets that are inherently and fundamentally unpredictable, and that's exhausting. And I think it accounts for a lot of the things you see. Over optimism, this sort of overconfidence is a form of overcoming that exhaustion by saying, "Hey, I know exactly what's going to happen because I'm this good. I know exactly what's going to happen." So that prevents the exhaustion. And it occurs to me that negativity bias does the same thing, like assuming that the sky is always falling or that the market's always about to crash is a form of overcoming that uncertainty too.
That's right.
That's right. Things that might seem very different on paper might seem like polar opposites are really sides of the same coin of that brain being a prediction machine.
That's right. And that's why, Daniel, by the way, and I kind of alluded to this to a degree. So there's an important point here, Daniel. I'm going to get on a soapbox for a second. If I had my way, I would ban the word irrational or irrationality from the English language, because what it does is it allows us to sit in judgment of another human being without understanding the context, without understanding what's going on inside their brain, ignoring this wiring that we've been talking about. And for me, ban the word and actually tell people when someone is doing something that from the outside looking in looks utterly mad, instead of being judgmental and calling them irrational, why not take a beat and instead be curious and try and understand why they think or are behaving the way that they are? Because, like we said, uncertainty is never good for a human brain, and maybe the way they are behaving is so that they can have more certainty, which puts them into a much more calmer, better state of mind. So don't be judgmental, be curious.
Replacing judgment with curiosity, if I could wave my magic wand and change the world in one way, that might just be it for the betterment of our political discourse and our, the way that we treat each other and a host of other things. And it turns out that it's good for your money life as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So another question, Neil, that I find there's a lot of dissent around, even within our buddies kind of in this behavioral finance space, is the role of emotion in decision-making and particularly financial decision-making. Mm-hmm. There's a camp that says, emotion should be stripped from, financial decision-making at every turn. There's a camp that says, emotion is signal and gives you insights into how you ought to be trading or investing. Where do you fall with respect to emotion and financial decision-making?
I fall into the camp that we should absolutely not be ignoring emotions, because they carry the evaluation signal, right? Emotions tell us what matters. And without them, so slight backtrack, great neuroscientist Antonio Damasio did some research into people who had temporal lobe damage. So in other words, the part of their brain that got damaged was the part that would process emotion correctly. And what it showed is that they could reason, they could understand that they had to make choices and they could, whys and why nots, but they could never make a decision because the emotional weight wasn't being processed. And I think there's a deeper point there, that emotions aren't this separate system that occasionally barges in and interrupts the serious business of rational thought. They are woven into every single level of how the brain processes information. And Antonio Damasio, same guy, great quote in his book called Descartes' Error, who said, we are not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think. And so for anyone working in financial services, that's got massive implications, massive practical implications. The emotion a client brings into a meeting, what they were listening to in the car on the way to your office, whether they've just a message they've just read on their phone, that's going to shape what they hear and how they respond far more than the quality of the presentation an advisor gives, right? So basically, I'm in the emotions are super important camp, because the emotional state of a client isn't the context around the conversation, it is the conversation.
So I love Damasio's research. I love Descartes' Error, the book. We know on the one hand, right, that even the way that I framed the conversation to you is a little bit of a false distinction, right? Because there's literally no such thing as an emotionless decision, and there's certainly no such thing as an emotionless decision about something as laden as your financial life. But can't it simultaneously be true that times of elevated emotion are maybe not the best time for you to be making investment decisions? How do you think about that? On the one hand, there is this reality that yes, every decision is emotional. You can't make a decision without an emotional substrate. And it's important to understand that. How do you reconcile that with, I think, the very natural impulse that folks have that, yeah, sometimes I'm very panicked or very excited about a decision, and maybe that's not the best time. Where does emotion fit in there?
So let me give you a quick biology lesson. So strap yourselves in. So,
yes.
So here's what happens. The human brain takes in data, touch, taste, smell, sound, sight, and all that is to the human brain is data. And from that data, the brain triggers an emotional response, instantaneously triggers an emotional response. Emotion comes first. We are not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think. When that data, or when that emotion is generated, if there is any sense of threat involved in that emotional framework, it triggers a part of the brain called the amygdala. People have heard of this, which in turn triggers our fight or flight mechanism, or our sympathetic nervous system. When our sympathetic nervous system gets triggered or activated, a part of the brain gets inhibited or shut down. And the part of the brain that gets inhibited is our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is needed for reasoning and decision making. So in any state of heightened emotion, worry, panic, fear, anxiety, whatever it is, the part of the brain you need to use to reason and think is not working. And so how on earth can we expect people to be quote unquote rational when we are asking them to make a decision that naturally triggers an emotional biological response in them that is inhibiting the very part of the brain that we need them to use? And so recognizing that this biology is just part of what it means to be human, it's part of the human condition, should signal to financial professionals that if I see a client in that state, I should not be asking them difficult, emotionally loaded questions. I need to get them, or I need them to be in a state of calm so that actually it lands correctly, but they have the cognitive and biological ability to answer the question that I'm asking them to answer.
You know, Neil, one of the things that I love about your insights is that all of this study of the different parts of the brains and the mechanics of the brain can feel sort of remote to me at times, but I think you do a beautiful job of bringing that down to a level where you can look at how something as convoluted as the wiring of your brain can directly impact something as quotidian as, your purchase or investment decisions on a given day. Right. Sticking with that gift of yours, one of the great puzzles in personal finance is that people genuinely want a better future. We all do. Yet we often in the day-to-day, in 1,000 little ways, act against our own long-term self-interest. Why is the brain so bad at relating to its future self?
Our friend Hal Hirschfield, from UCLA. He's done some beautiful work on this. fMRI research where, people were asked about their future selves, and what he found was that the brain patterns that were picked up in these fMRI scans, these brain scans, looked pretty much identical to when you ask someone to think about a stranger. So, in essence, the brain treats your future self as someone else entirely. And the implications of that for anyone, for anything involved in delayed reward or deferred reward, like saving for retirement, is the obvious example, is actually quite devastating. Because you ask someone to put money away for their 70-year-old self, you're not actually asking them to make a sacrifice. You're asking them to make a sacrifice for their own future. You're also asking them to give money to a stranger, someone they don't recognize, someone that they have no emotional connection to. And that's a really different ask. And unsurprisingly, the brain kind of goes, nope, don't like that. And Hal, I think his research is incredible. He also found that, something that I love is show people an aged processed image of themselves and, their face digitally aged to maybe age 70, and their future self suddenly feels more real. And then his evidence was that then ask them to make financial decisions and they typically save more money. So what that does is it bridges that gap between, stranger and me in the future, makes it more concrete. But I will say alongside all of this sits the behavioural bias of present bias, which is a tendency to give disproportionate weight to the immediate. But that's because immediate experiences feel more vivid and real. The future feels abstract and distant. And so the brain, back to the original conversation, the brain evolved in what is known as an immediate return environment, where the future was genuinely uncertain and the present was all that mattered. And, now what was entirely sensible then has become a bit of a liability now.
I'm pulling out and taking notes on all these great one-liners you have, Neil, and one of them is, you wouldn't give money to a stranger, right? You wouldn't give money to a stranger. I'm not about to just hand over large sums of money to a stranger. So until we cozy up, right, to that future self, cozy up to the reality of that future self existing, it's simply not going to happen. And I think we have to, whether it's through aged photographs or, conversations with a spouse or just a reflection on the reality of that future self, doing something to make that more visceral. I wrote about in the Soul of Wealth, research by the Clances that found that vividly getting very granular, very specific about what your future self wanted to do, not just like, I want to retire to the mountains, but, I want to retire to Park City in a house with a green roof that faces the east. And I mean, just, getting as specific and as granular as possible about that is a powerful thing. So, Neil, as we wrap up here today, if you could correct one misunderstanding financial advisors have about human behavior, what would it be? And it can't be that we're irrational. You got to get a new soapbox for us. What misunderstanding are you correcting?
Yeah, but you know what? If clients, it's a difficult one. I don't like you anymore. So I am going to say this: if advisors can recognize that clients are fundamentally rational beings who occasionally get emotional, just flip that round and we get much closer to the truth. So but what financial services was built on is a model called Homo economicus, right? The idea that people make decisions by rationally weighing costs and benefits, blah blah blah. And we know that thanks to decades of behavioral science research that model is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And yet the infrastructure of advice, the reports, the projections, the risk questionnaires, the model portfolios are still largely built on that model. And that has a practical consequence. Because if you believe your client is rational, then when they behave in a way that feels off, you'll see it as a problem to be corrected with more information. Give them another chart, show them the long-term data. But information isn't what's needed. They need understanding. And what is and understand, and I guess to choose something different, I'd like, what is the emotion telling you? Own the emotional framework that is being presented to you in the room. And what does it reveal about what this client truly values, what they truly fear, what they need from this relationship? And I think the advisor who can read that is operating at a completely different level to one who is constantly reaching for a spreadsheet.
Yeah. The closing thought, less information, more understanding. Neil, I love it. If people want more regular access to your ideas and insights, if they've been wowed like I have, if they've learned something like I have today, where can folks read more of your work and tap into these insights more regularly?
Well, I have a Substack called How We're Wired, and substack.neilbage.com. I think that's correct, but I'm on Substack, How We're Wired. And that's my fortnightly, we would say in the UK. Every 2 weeks, I publish an article there about different parts of life and how the brain is wired to deal with that part of life. And it's getting some really cool reviews, which I love. And also, I am on LinkedIn.
Well, it's a fantastic resource, and you are a fantastic science translator and friend. Neil, thank you for being one of the greatest guests of the show of all time, and thank you for joining us again. That's Neil Bage, folks, and until next time, I'm Daniel Crosby. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.